Hi, everyone. Welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn,
And I'm Christina.
and we're part of the Nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. For those that don't know, Nightlife is our weekly Thursday night events where we mix science and creatures with a little live music and cocktails. We're all cozy at home right now, so we are actually going to bring a little bit of Nightlife to you with Night School instead. We're here every Thursday with a new theme, and tomorrow is Lunar New Year. Happy Lunar New Year Eve, everyone. So with that, tonight we're going to bring in the Year of the Ox with a little ode to the moon.
Can we get oxes who are watching out here to say something in the comments? I'm an ox. Anyway, we're going to bring you a lot of different aspects of the moon tonight. We had a lot of fun programming tonight, so we hope you like it. So first off, do you see faces in places? What about faces in spaces? Anyway, Josh Roberts from the Morrison Planetarium is going to address the man in the moon and other face-finding phenomenon in the universe. Then we're moving on to something that you'll probably only see if you're in the know, and that's a mass coral spawning. Dr. Rebecca Albright, a curator of invertebrate zoology here at the Academy, is here to talk about corals and their surprising connection to lunar cycles. We're very honored to have artist Flo Oy Wong with us. She's going to share a poem, art, and memories of growing up in Oakland's Chinatown during the 40s and 50s. And finally, what's a Lunar New Year celebration without dumplings? We have food blogger Christina Cho with us for an artful dumpling making demonstration.
And as always, our program is live. Last week, everyone was sharing what snacks they had in the comments. So say hi, let us know what snacks you're eating, where you're watching from, if it's your first time joining us. We'll have a couple Q&As sprinkled throughout the program, so get your questions ready. And with that, we'll send it off to Josh.
Good evening, everyone. Please don't hold the bad wordplay against Christina. I'm the one who decided to call this Faces on Places and Spaces, and I think I have to bear the brunt of that stupidity. But thank you all for joining us here. We are here to talk about a really cool phenomenon called Paraidolia. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Big shout out to the person who introduced me to this concept originally, one of our former Morrison Planetarium presenters. That's Colin Elliott. He has some really cool stuff to say about it. And a little bit of a caveat, I am an astronomer by trade. I'm not a psychologist, and this really is a psychological phenomenon. So I'm going to do my best to convey a really cool, factual, accurate representation, but it is a deep and interesting subject. So if there's more stuff you want to check out, there is no replacement for going out and looking up from an authoritative research or an authoritative site exactly what this is about. But with that, we can put on some of our really cool software. This is a program called Open Space, and it's actually one that you can download at home. A lot of times when we're doing something awesome in our planetarium, it's with software that costs thousands and thousands of dollars, but this one is totally free. You can download it, you can play with it, you can basically do the exact same thing I'm about to do at your home to impress your family and friends. So when we're talking about pareidolia, this is something I bet you are familiar with in a pretty fundamental way. I've got a picture I want to show you. Hopefully that's legible. What you see there is a whole bunch of stuff around your house. But I bet if you look at any of those things long enough, you'll see something that kind of looks like a face. Turns out humans are great at pulling information from where there really isn't any. We can see Elvis on a piece of toast. We can see a little man staring back at us from our electrical socket. There are all sorts of things we can pull information from where there isn't actually information there. That can get us into some pretty big problems when we start connecting dots, but it actually leads to some pretty cool stuff too. For example, our constellations. When we look at constellations in the night sky, fundamentally, we're mostly just seeing random collections of stars. Some of them are groups of stars that actually travel through the universe together, but a lot of them just happen to be brightish or similarly bright objects that we see from our perspective, and we've decided to connect the dots in some interesting ways. Now, these two parts of pareidolia kind of get connected when we talk about perhaps the most familiar phenomenon, which is looking at our moon. So I'm going to connect us over to our moon and fly us out there. And on the way, I want you to think about all the times you might have seen our moon. Now, granted, we're at a new moon right now, So in truth, it would be impossible for us to see the moon, but through the magic of our software, we can actually pretend that sunlight is shining on the part of the moon that would normally be completely dark. That is the side of the moon that faces to us. When we look at the moon from Earth, generally we see something that is super duper white and bright. In fact, it can kind of be tough to see that there's variation in the surface because the sun is so bright, especially during a full moon. You can see maybe some parts are a little lighter, some parts are a little darker, but our moon is very bright. But people have been looking at that bright surface with their own eyes and deciding that they see something looking back at them in some pretty awesome ways. So I think, Lynn, you've got a couple photos queued up. I'm going to see if we can pop some of those on. And I'm going to try my very best to do some fancy piloting and get us lined up just right. There we go. So, can you see a bunny on the moon? We made these to help out our kindergartners, but I think they're pretty good for us too. If you take the image away, you can kind of see exactly where the rabbit's ears are. Right there on the surface of the moon, you can see one ear here, the other ear here, the dark body, the tail, and the radish is going with. Some people see a drum there. There are other ways of imagining faces looking back at you from the moon, though. Let's try another one. Do we have any of the others queued up? There we go. This is one Bing Kwok has suggested, and once you see it, you can never go back. So I kind of apologize. This is the T-Rex riding a bicycle on the moon. He's about to get hit by an asteroid you can see coming down there. But if you take the image away, now you can kind of see where the T-Rex is. You can see his jaws, his body, his little tricycle down there. And I think we had one more. I like this one a lot. So a lot of our stories about the moon focus on a feminine deity or a maiden who got stuck on the moon. This is perhaps one of the trickier ones to spot. But again, once you see it, it's tough not to see it. A fairly obvious face. So people have been looking at the moon for as long as there have been people, and the moon has pretty much looked the exact same. So when we look at the moon, it's only natural for us to see somebody staring back because humans are just so good at pulling this information from the moon itself. But it turns out it's not just the moon. As we got better and better images of pretty much any world we looked at, we began to discover that there were similar phenomenon there. Now, perhaps the most famous example of this happened not on Earth, not on the moon, but at our next planet over. This is Mars. And if Mars looks like it has some kind of weird skin condition, I want to apologize. This is our high-res imagery tiled all over the Martian surface. If it looks like someone took a paintbrush and changed the color of little strips of Mars, we're actually putting on ultra-high-resolution images on those places. This is called our Ctx Imagery, and it's from an orbital camera sending us these photos. And in them, we can see some really cool stuff. So once upon a time, we had our early orbiters sending back photos of Mars, and someone spotted, whoop, not that one, this one. This is the Sidonian Sphinx, the face on Mars, and people got tremendously excited that an ancient civilization on Mars had constructed a thing that looks exactly like a person and set it in a place where we would find it to know that they knew what we looked like. The idea never really made that much sense to me. Maybe there were supposed to be humans on Mars, but fundamentally it was just that we saw something that looked like a face. But I hope you know where this is going. Turns out that the face on Mars is an example of human beings deriving that information, pulling something from where there wasn't actually anything there. And how can I prove that to you? Well, with these ultra high-res images, we can actually zoom in to the exact location that this photo was taken. I am going to take you onto an ultra high resolution image of the surface of Mars from right where the Sidonian Sphinx was taken. I want you to see if you can spot it. You see him looking back at you? Our brains are so marvelous, I bet you can, because he's right there in the middle. You can see the Sidonian Sphinx looking at us, one eye, two eyes, and the face there. But with this high-resolution imagery, it really doesn't look quite so compelling, not really so obvious. It looks a lot more like a hill. Turns out that's what we're pretty sure it is. So this is a cool example, to be sure, but again, not the only one. There's at least one other kind of silly one that I love showing people, especially in our school shows, and that is on our next planet out. We did the moon, we did Mars. Now we're going to go check out Jupiter. Now on Jupiter, we have not really the same kind of structure, because on the moon, on Mars, we have rocky stuff. Rocky stuff, when it gets pushed into a specific position, stays there for a long time. The same cannot be said of Jupiter. It's a gaseous planet. It is constantly moving and churning. So I'm going to show you something that I think is hilarious and wonderful and awesome, but I can pretty much guarantee that were we to send a spacecraft back to Jupiter to snap a better photo, it would be gone, because Jupiter's surface is always changing. I'm not positive of that fact, but I'd be willing to bet. So let's check this out. Over on the side of Jupiter, right next to the Great Red Spot, in a set of, I believe, Hubble images, we got something super cool. So you can see the Great Red Spot right there. Now let's go find the structure known as Jupy McJove face, or Jovie McJove face. Can you see it? It's really good. There's some great memes of it online, of Jupiter being caffeine deprived and trying to care for its some odd moons. It is a great picture. So 2 eyes and kind of a mouth, sort of looks like an emoji. Again, not really a face, to be sure. It would be a gigantic face if it was. Those eyeballs have to be almost the size of Earth. But this is a random structure in the universe that human brains decided looks just like us. I'm not exactly sure why we see faces so often, but I can bet that at some point in human evolutionary history, it was a really good thing for us to be able to identify where there were people around us. And that seems like an advantageous trait. So I'm going to take us back to our own familiar stomping grounds, our very own planet Earth. Again, with a reminder that if this is cool and you want to check out some of these exact same images, download OpenSpace. You can go to the openspaceproject.org and download, play with it yourself. I'm going to take us in to, I believe it's Canada. Yes, where there's an absolutely wonderful example called the Badlands Guardian. And this is one of those things on Earth, you could say, well, what if people built this? What if long ago people constructed this? It would be a big challenge. It's a large structure, to be sure, but there's an even bigger one that no one would really recognize it unless you had satellite photography. It's so ginormous, you wouldn't see it from the ground. Humans have made geoglyphs. We did a whole planetarium show about the amazing art human beings have inscribed on the surface of our planet. But I would say this isn't, because it is just a hill. In fact, it's a bunch of hills that when you look at them just right, really look like a face. But this one is absolutely beautiful, absolutely special, and I think a fitting end to our discussion, because it is just so fantastically cool. So I'm going to say, when you see a face here, drop an X in the chat so we can check it out. Renee, awesome suggestion of exactly what the Jupiter face looks like. I wholeheartedly approve. But when you see a face here, let us know. Have you got it? So this is the Badlands Guardian. I can show it to you, I think, right here. We've got a big headdress, eyes, a nose, and a mouth. This is an absolutely beautiful version of this effect, where human beings can get that information, really something from nothing, in a wonderful and profound way. So if you want to turn this amazing part of our brains to good, go check out citizen science projects. There's a lot of them that use this exact pattern collecting part of our brain to wonderful effect. So if you are so inclined, check out projects like Galaxy Zoo, and you can start using this pattern recognition superpower that we share to some really awesome ends. But with that, I think I've hit all my major points. I can hand it back. And if anyone has questions, I would love to try and answer some. Let's see. I've got a whole bunch.
Hi, Josh.
Hi, Lynn. How's it going?
It's good. I can't unsee Jupy McCute face now, but I kind of love it.
It's a good one, to be sure.
No questions just yet. A bunch of X's.
That's good. People are exercising the pattern recognition part of the brain.
Yeah, but I'm curious. I mean, the T-Rex is, I think, the weirdest one for me, or most interesting, but is there another one that you think is like strange
I gotta
that you
say,
didn't show?
When Bing showed us the T-Rex, that absolutely captivated me. One of the really cool ones that I think we don't get to talk about enough, there's a frog people see in the moon. There's a fox people see in the moon. One of the really cool ones is a crab people see in the moon. So if you want to check that one out, just imagine where the T-Rex's jaws are is the crab's claw. And where the T-Rex's body was would be sort of its round central carapace. I don't know if crabs have bodies. Do they have
I can
thoraxes?
put the
I have no
T-Rex
idea.
back up.
Okay,
I mean,
well,
this
actually,
is on-
let me point us at the moon. Then we can get some
Yeah,
context.
I'm like,
what a
that's
good
not-
idea. It's a different round thing. Okay. But when we look at, oh, it lined up almost perfectly. How
Nice.
cool. So when we're looking around here, you can see anything you want. I think it's amazing that people will see what they have been shown. So if you see the T-Rex and you want to show more people the T-Rex, share that story around. But if you've heard other stories about people who live on the moon, people who look back at us, the man in the moon, the maiden in the moon, the rabbit in the moon, share those stories. Help other people see what you see. Human brains are just so good at this discernment, this pulling information out. I love it when people can take those stories and share them with the folks around them. Yeah, let's see. We had one question I saw pop up about raining diamonds. So we can talk about the outer planets. They don't have many solid features we look at over and over again. But we do think that there's carbon solids that rain down in Uranus and Neptune, and that would be what some people like to poetically imagine as a rain of diamonds, which sounds a lot better than getting hit by shards of pencil lead. But you can call it what you like at that point.
We also have a few other questions. What is your favorite iteration of this phenomenon?
I've always seen a face in electrical sockets. So that was my first connection to this, was definitely like, oh, like the man in the electrical socket who looks back at you. So I would say that is my favorite. It's the one that's most commonplace in my life because I spend a lot of time around computers plugging stuff in.
I think it's easy to find too. Another one that came in is, does the man in the moon look upside down from the southern hemisphere?
Yeah, actually, if you have traveled to the southern hemisphere, I thought that was one of the coolest, weirdest things. When you walk outside, all the stars are in different positions, but I kind of expected that. What I didn't expect, and I should have, is the moon is upside down. So the man in the moon is upside down. The woman in the moon is upside down. The frog in the moon is right side up because he's normally upside down. But all of these things just looked different, and it really made you feel like you were standing on your head. So I would encourage folks, if you spend a lot of time looking at the moon and you ever have an opportunity to go to the southern hemisphere, or if you live in the southern hemisphere, go to the northern hemisphere and pay attention to those little details. Astronomers often get sort of frustrated by the people who keep insisting we live on a flat planet, even though that's sort of a contradiction in terms. But if you pay attention to the world around you, I think a lot of those things just disappear because the universe is showing us some really awesome stuff. All we have to do is pay attention to it.
Cool. More questions. Do you know what is the oldest historical record of a face or other shape on the moon?
Gosh, I have no clue. But that I know some of these stories are really old. So I would guess probably thousands of years, but that's a guess. This would be an awesome question for a cultural anthropologist or astronomer. But I will tackle that and try and look it up. That's a solvable question.
If you find it while we're still
I'll put it
doing
in the chat.
night school, throw it in the chat.
Will do.
And then last question, are there any fun emojis on Saturn or Neptune?
Saturn has a weird hexagon you can see on its polar area, and because these are stormy planets, every so often you'll see two storms kind of drift close to each other and everybody's brain goes, googly eyes. But they didn't have a really cool one like Jupiter did. I love Jupy McJove face, so I always want to show that one off. But we need more high resolution photos of Uranus and Saturn, I guess, is the real answer to that question.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Josh. That was a fun one to kick off the night. Next up, we have Dr. Rebecca Albright, who will talk more about coral spawning.
I'll be tuning in.
Rebecca, you're on.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Christina. Thanks to all of you guys for joining me this evening. I hope you're all safe and well at home. My name is Rebecca Albright. I'm a curator here at the Academy, and my area of expertise is coral biology. So I've studied various aspects of coral biology, ecology for the last 15 to 20 years, including coral reproduction, calcification, ecology, impacts of climate change. But tonight, I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about two of my favorite things, which are corals and the moon. And so the link between these things might not be immediately obvious, but hopefully by the end of this talk, it will become abundantly clear that the lunar cycle is intricately involved in coral physiology and biology, specifically reproduction. So this is exactly what it looks like. It's a screenshot that I took this afternoon of my work calendar. So a little known secret of coral biologists, particularly those of us who study coral reproduction, is that our lives revolve around the lunar cycle. So this snapshot shows you April of this year for me, and May looks really similar. But what you can see is the full moon here in both March and in April is highlighted in purple. And then there's a series about 10 days, a few days after that full moon, that I've designated as spawn watch. And so the same happens in May. And it doesn't matter if it's Easter, Mother's Day, your birthday, all of these things have happened over the last 15 to 20 years. When the moon and the lunar cycles say that it's time for corals to reproduce, you better believe that we're going to be in the lab or in the field diving or monitoring for baby corals. So corals reproduce two main ways. They reproduce sexually and asexually. Asexually, they're very similar to a starfish. So if an arm breaks off of a starfish, then that starfish can regenerate a new arm, and the arm can regenerate a new starfish. And a similar thing is true for corals. So if you break a branch off of a coral, like you see here on the right in this image, that original branch can regenerate a new coral colony, and then the coral colony can regenerate a new branch. And when this asexual reproduction occurs, you're generating new coral material, but they're all clones of one another. So they're genetically identical. And so sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is the pathway through which corals and all animals generate new genetic diversity. And so corals do that in one of two main ways, brooding, which is when corals have internal fertilization, much like humans. And then internally, they will grow embryos that grow into larvae. And then those larvae are released into the water, and they'll swim down to the bottom of the ocean and settle, metamorphose, and grow into a new coral. And then there's also a mode of sexual reproduction that we call spawning. And that's when corals release eggs and sperm into the water column. And there's external fertilization. Embryos develop into larvae inside the water column. And those eventually swim down and settle, metamorphose, and start to grow into actual coral colonies. And these mass spawning events, the annual timing of these spawning events is very heavily dictated by the moon. So we think that there are about 700 to 800 different stony or hard coral species in the world. And we also think that about 75%, or around 600 of all of those different coral species, their primary mode of sexual reproduction is annual mass spawning events. So once a year, they have these mass spawning events. They typically fall late in the summer, a few days after a full moon, and a few hours after sunset. So as a coral researcher, we have these predictions, spawning predictions for all the different species. And so this is an example, a snapshot of a coral spawning prediction that was produced last year by an organization called CARMABI, which is the Caribbean Marine Biological Institute based in Curacao. And what you can see at the top here that I've circled is days AFM. That stands for days after full moon. So DAFM or NAFM, nights after full moon, is an acronym that coral biologists and reproductive biologists are intimately familiar with. And this is just how many nights after the full moon that particular species spawns. So here we have a bunch of different Caribbean species. We have Diploria labyrinthiformis, Montastria cavernosa, Copophilia nathans, which month they spawn, however many nights after the full moon they spawn, and then however many hours after sunset they might spawn. And so these types of predictive charts are what we use as researchers to know when to go out and target these species and look for reproductive activity. So what we do when we see that is we find our target species. We go out on nights that we think that they're likely to spawn. They're night dives because it's usually after sunset. And then we monitor colonies for any sort of reproductive or spawning activity. And that can look different in different species. So there's some species, like one called Diploria labyrinthiformis, and it's a brain coral in the Caribbean, that when it's dusk, you go out during an evening dive, beautiful time of day, and we follow butterfly fish, because those butterfly fish can sniff out the corals that are likely to spawn, because usually when they spawn, it's a bit of a feeding frenzy in the ocean. And so we follow those fish, and the fish will go from colony to colony and sniff. And if they start to linger and congregate around a colony, we know that's a colony that's probably going to spawn. And then we can net that colony and collect some of the spawn for restoration purposes or scientific purposes. Other species that when about 30 minutes before they're going to spawn, the egg and sperm bundles will come up into the mouth of the polyp, and you can actually see it. We call it setting. And so we'll look really closely with red lights, not white lights, because that will disrupt everything because it's nighttime. But we take red lights underwater, and you look really closely at all of the individual polyps and mouths. And if they have these gamete bundles in them, that's an indication that they're going to spawn within the next 20 to 30 minute window. So we're out there night diving, and if we see indication, we might net the colony like you can see here. And then when they do, we don't net the entire thing. We don't want to take all of the spawn, obviously. But when they do release, the gamete bundles will slowly float up into these little collector cups, and then we can take some of it back to the lab for restoration purposes, for experiments, whatever you might want. And so these vials here contain eggs at the top, and then the sperm is in this cloudy water below. And you can separate those. Here's a closer picture of the eggs and the sperm. You can separate those and then fertilize them under whatever conditions you want in the lab. And we do this for restoration purposes to try to shepherd corals through these vulnerable early life history stages and then outplant them when they have a better chance of survival. Here's a big vat of coral embryos that are starting to grow. Lots of different bats, so millions and millions of tiny little coral embryos and larvae. And then here's a picture of an individual baby coral that's settled onto a substrate that will eventually plant back out onto the reef. And so the last thing that I want to mention is how we might simulate this in the lab. In order to, in a captive setting or for a conservation breeding application, how we simulate these different lunar cues to try to trigger coral reproduction in an aquarium setting. And this is a project that I've been working on for the last 4 years at the Academy in conjunction with the Steinhardt Aquarium. And so this is using protocols that were originally produced by the Horniman Museum and a researcher named Jamie Craggs in London. And then we adopted them in San Francisco. And so what we have to do is year round, because these corals only spawn once a year and their gametogenic cycle is 9 months approximately, similar to a human, we have to simulate all of the different seasonal and environmental cues that they might need in order to undergo this reproductive event. And we've mentioned obviously that lunar cycles is one of those. So the 4 big ones that we focus on in our system are seasonal changes in temperature. So they have to experience a summer and a winter. Lunar cycles. So this is our programming table you can see up here on the right. And we have to program in for every month of the year, the time of moon rise, the time of moon set, and the day of the month of the new moon. And then we have blue lights that are simulating lunar light that will come on at different intensities, 100% if it's a full moon, 0% if it's a new moon, and then incrementally change as the moon waxes and wanes in our experimental system. And then we're also simulating solar insolation and day length through sunrise and sunset times. I'm going to show a very brief 1-minute video of this project over the last few years. Hopefully you can all see that okay. So this was one of the first coral spawning labs in the US to be built. They're becoming more popular now. There are places in London, there are places in Florida. There's one in Australia that's underway, and this is all as a scientific resource and as a conservation breeding technique. So you might imagine for zoos and for a lot of different animals that are endangered, that you start to try to understand how you can take these animals into a land-based setting and care for them in a way that's in their best interest. These are some of the corals that we collected that are spawning in our aquaria in Steinhardt in the middle of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, which was really exciting. The first spawn we had was in 2018. So they're releasing gamete bundles slowly into the water. Each one of those mouths and polyps has one gamete bundle. And one of the really exciting things last year was that, well, so here's a picture of some of the corals that we grew out of this system. So this picture was taken in, this picture was taken in April of last year. So they're now about two years old, and I wish I had a more recent picture for you. They're about 10 centimeters in diameter. They're huge, they're beautiful. And I'm actually going to monitor them this year to see if these babies have actually spawned. So these are individuals that we spawned, we fertilized, we reared in our system in San Francisco, and now those babies might actually spawn again. And this is a branch of one of the corals showing the eggs. This is how we check to see if they're reproductive. So you can take a branch off and actually see the gamete bundles inside of the branch about a month prior to spawning. So you know that that colony is likely to spawn. And what was particularly exciting about this individual was this was one that we got from the wild. It spawned in our system. We kept it in the system for a year, and it underwent the entire gametogenic cycle in our system with those lunar and seasonal cues. And then it spawned at the exact same time as the native populations back in Palau, which was, from a conservation breeding standpoint, was so exciting. And this happened last April during COVID. And so you can imagine some of the things we can do with a system like this. So we're using it for restoration and conservation research. We're using it to advance fundamental biology questions around corals, like sperm activation, germline segregation, microbiome changes. We've developed a genome with it, all different kinds of things that you can do in a controlled setting, none the least of which is advancing these techniques to be able to shepherd corals through these early life history stages. And the last thing I want to point out is that last year during COVID, so that we could share this with the public since we were closed, we built a coral reef spawning webcam. And so this is a picture of me doing a live stream, and this is a coral colony that's spawning in Steinhardt, and we were able to share that with the public. And we're going to be doing that again this year in April and possibly May. So just keep an eye out on the Academy's Facebook page. I'm sure we'll share details once we have a more clear time frame of exactly when that might happen. But I'm hoping that we can get all of you guys engaged in actually seeing the spawn again this year, because that was really exciting. With that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you so much. I hope you guys are all doing well.
Rebecca, we have so many questions. So let's get started. I mean, okay, so I was like trying to put them in order to see, but there's so many coming in. But anyway, everyone's like, they're just like, this is incredible. I didn't know. I'm learning so much. But then just a basic question, like, why do corals spawn around the full moon? Is it the tide or the light of the full moon that signals the release, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't 100% know, but we do know. So corals obviously don't have eyes, but they do have light sensitive neurons that are tuned into blue wavelengths of light, like dim blue wavelengths of light that are similar to the moon. And so we know that they have families of genes called cryptochromes, which a lot of different animals have, that are linked to circadian rhythms and biological clocks. And the expression of those genes peaks around full moons for a lot of species. And so they have tons of photoreceptive and photosensory cells and genes that are responsible for sensing these dim blue wavelengths. And then the expression of all that changes with the lunar cycle. So it does have to do with the actual moonlight itself. And there are some species that if it's been particularly cloudy for several weeks before, they won't spawn, and they might spawn the next month. So it definitely does have to do with the moonlight itself. There is some indication it also has to do with tides, but which one of those is a stronger pull on the actual reproductive cue, we're not sure at this point. But that's a great question.
Yeah, people were wondering too about like particularly cloudy nights and how that affects. So it's really interesting.
So interestingly, so there's a couple of different things going on. There's the actual lunar cue, which is linked more to these circadian rhythms. And then there's the incident light level, which is what is the actual, like the sunset. And so you can actually do what's called darking corals early. We trick them. And so in our lab at the Academy, and this is not related to the moon, this is related to the sun. So they're cueing in on both. But at the Academy, for example, this species in the wild spawns at a few hours after sunset, which in Palau is around 6:30. So they would be spawning at about 8:30, 9:30, which means that if we want to do research and experiments, we're up till 2:30, 3:30, 4:30 in the morning. So we simulate sunset at I believe it's 9:30 in the morning is when we dim all of our lights and simulate our sunset, and then they will spawn at 11:30, and then we have the rest of the afternoon to do their work. So you can trick them into thinking that it's a different time of day or a different time of month.
Can you like speed up the cycles? Like, could you make them think it's like the full moon like every day or every week, or how does that work?
So that's a really interesting question. We don't know, but there, it would be like trying to truncate a pregnancy. Like it's the gametogenic cycle takes about 7 to 9 months to make eggs. Sperm are a lot quicker, but eggs is about 7 to 9 months for the whole oogenic cycle. But interestingly, there is another type of marine invertebrate, a cnidarian also, that has a faster life cycle. It's about on the order of a week. It's a kind of small anemone. And they were able to truncate the life cycle of that by, instead of exposing them to a 24-hour cycle of light, they did 12 hours. So they basically just halved, like instead of a 3-hour sunrise, they did a 1.5-hour sunrise. And instead of 12 hours of daylight, they did 6 hours of daylight. So they shortened everything to a 12-hour day. And it took 3 generations, so 3 weeks, and it worked. And they were able to actually truncate everything reproductively for that species, which is amazing. And it would be so cool if we could do that in corals. But the problem is that it takes a year in coral. They don't have a generation of a week, generation of a year. So we have to to do, multiple generations. We won't know that answer for 4 or 5 years, but it would be super cool if it worked.
Yeah. Let's see, lots of questions. So yeah, just here's a question I just saw pop up. Are you attempting to develop strains or develop different types of coral that may be resistant to warming seas?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of people working on that question. Incidentally, I have a postdoc who will be starting in a couple of months with me who is interested in looking at thermal priming in early life history stages. So trying to understand if you can expose early stages to different temperatures in the hopes of inferring a downstream benefit to adult stages. So it's something we're going to look at from a fundamental biology standpoint, just to see if there's any if there's any evidence that might work. We at the Academy aren't really in a position to breed corals for outplanting. So that's not the goal. We're using the system more to understand different restoration or biological applications that we could then maybe translate into the field at some point through other partners. But we're not actively breeding thermally tolerant corals. But there are a lot of people around the world that are addressing that from different points.
Cool. And then Yeah, and just a question, does pollution prevent corals from reproducing?
That's a great question. So there is some indication that light pollution in very heavily populated coastal areas can interfere with it's controversial, so we don't really know how true it is, but there's some studies that suggest that light pollution near cities can interfere with spawning cues for corals. So,
and then you know, the big question is warming climates affecting coral reproduction at all?
yeah, so in a multitude of ways, global warming is affecting reproduction. And so yes, there's so many different ways to answer that question. So I'll just answer two ways right now, but one way is that you may know that global warming of oceans causes coral bleaching, which causes coral death, often, not always, but often. So bleaching is the reason why a lot of populations are declining right now. And we don't fully understand it, but in order to have these mass synchronous spawning events, they seem to be influenced by pheromones, and there seems to be some sort of like population density that might need to be critical in order to have that event happen. So because bleaching is causing populations of corals to become more disparate, that we're seeing a breakdown in the synchronicity of coral spawning, and we don't know exactly why that is, if it's pollution, if it's the fact that they're fewer and farther between, but indirectly through mortality, warming might be causing a kind of a breakdown in that synchronicity. Another way that it directly impacts it is there's been a lot of different studies that show abnormal growth, abnormal development in coral embryos and coral larvae, at higher temperatures. So if corals experience, say, 28 degrees Celsius as opposed to 31 degrees Celsius, at 31, you'll see a lot more abnormal cleavage in the embryos, some, larvae that don't survive or larvae that can't settle. There's a lot of aberrant cleavage and weird development that happens at higher temperatures. So those are just a couple of the ways. There's a wide variety of ways that warming impacts reproduction, but those are a few of the obvious ones.
Well, I think that's it for Q&A tonight, but thank you so much, Rebecca, and good luck on all your baby corals this year.
Thank you. Come back and everybody tune in April and May for the spawning cam.
Yeah.
Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
Bye. Okay, and up next, we're going from the oceans to somewhere a little bit more local, Oakland's Chinatown, and we have artist, poet, and educator Flo Oy Wong.
Hi, everyone. I'm just really happy to be here to learn about coral and to learn about constellations in the moon. And the moon is really important to all of us who celebrate the Lunar New Year because our calendar is based on the moon. So what I want to start with is I'm going to be reading you a poem that I wrote to honor the year of the ox arrival in our lives. And I'm going to be reading it in my native Hoisan-wa dialect. And Hoisan-wa is a dialect that is spoken by 5 regions in China. And at one time historically, it was the dialect that was spoken in all of the Chinatowns in the US, but it's different now. So Lynn, if you could put up my slide for the poem, I would appreciate that. Thank you. So the poem I wrote is about the year of the ox coming. And it goes like this. Ngao Lin Loy, Slin Nin Loy, Slin Nin Loy, Gung He Fat Toi, Gung He Fat Toi, Ngao Lin Loy, Ngao Lin Loy. New Year arrives, New Year arrives. Good luck blossoms, good luck blossoms. Ox year comes, ox years come. Slin Nin Loy, Slin Nin Loy. Gung He Fat Toy, Gung He Fat Toy, Ngao Nin Loy, Ngao Nin Loy. And so it is a bilingual poem and is sandwiched, the English is sandwiched by the Hoisan-wa. And Hoisan-wa is very different from Mandarin. And there is a relationship to Cantonese, which is Samyuk. So I'm going to read the poem in Samyuk and then move on to the next thing. So in Samyuk, it would sound like this. Ngao Nin Loy, Sun Nin Loy, Sun Nin Loy, Gung Hei Fa Choi, Gung Hei Fa Choi, Ngao Nin Loy, Ngao Nin Loy. New Year arrives, New Year arrives. Good luck blossoms, good luck blossoms. Ox year comes, ox year comes. Sun Nin Loy, Sun Nin Loy. Gung Hei Fa Choi, Gung Hei Fa Choi, Ngao Nin Loy, Ngao Nin Loy. So poetry has always been a central part of our lives, of the Asian culture. And my poem is a children's folk poem. And I want to take a few minutes to tell you about what life was like in Oakland, Chinatown from the 1940s to the early 1960s for me. I was born in 1938, and by the time 1943 rolled around, my mother and father opened a restaurant in Oakland, Chinatown, and it served Chinese and also American food. And we had a lot of customers, but we always got excited when it was time for the Lunar New Year to come, because the San Francisco Chinese hospital dragon would come, and we would burn firecrackers. We would just have a festive time. And I was in school at the time when the dragon would come. And so what I did was I forged a letter to the principal using my mother's name, saying that, I had to leave. Well, I was leaving school to chase the dragon. And the dragon was just so beautiful with all kinds of colors. And there were dancers in the body and the tail and in the head. And, it just brought festivity and color and sound to Chinatown. And in this drawing that I did is from my Oakland Chinatown series, I have my mother and my father. My mom is there behind the word town. My dad is behind the fish. And I'm in the upper left-hand corner of the drawing. And each one of us is protected by a symbol. My symbol is the phoenix, because the phoenix rises from the ashes. And if you look at me in the left-hand corner, I'm also protected by the symbol of the sky, the clouds. And that's that heart-shaped area that is pointing to my right eye. And my father and mother are connected by a fish, because for the Chinese, in Chinese New Year time, in Cantonese, Samyuk, we say Nin Nin Loy Luh. Every year you have fish. And so at our New Year's dinners in Oakland, Chinatown, at different places, at the laundries, at the grocery stores, at the bookstores, whatever, there was always a room in the back where the families would have dinner. Or if they didn't have dinner at their place of business, they would have it at home. But whenever we serve fish, what we do is we always leave the head on, and we always leave the tail on. And that's because the Chinese really believed in something has a beginning and something has an end. And that's the same with the chicken that we serve, what we call the ham soi gai, or the yin gai. The head of the chicken was always put on the plate, and not so much the tail, but once in a while there would be the tail. And so Chinatown is derivative of communities that our parents remembered when they lived in China. And so they brought a transatlantic culture to us. And so those of us who are American born sometimes feel that we're bifurcated. We have one foot in America and one foot in China. The next slide, please. And here are my mother and father at our house outside of Chinatown. And we celebrated the Lunar New Year, but we also celebrated Western holidays, and we love celebrating our birthdays. And so there's my dad cutting his birthday cake, and there's my mom, and there's the stack of plates, and behind them is a scroll. And the scroll is very interesting. It had all the principles of life. It would say something like, oh, you wake up in the morning, open the windows so that you could get fresh air. And then it would guide you and tell you what to do and how to do. And we had that hanging in our dining room at times. But when we lived in Chinatown, we didn't have such fancy surroundings. We lived in very, very humble ways. And we always, we worked in the restaurant, and other people worked in their grocery stores. My friends worked in fish. There weren't children working in the fish markets, but there were children working in the other businesses. And we just had a lot of fun. And what happened was that during Chinese New Year time, we would go out and light firecrackers. And then when the dragon came, we got so excited because my father wrapped the money in lettuce, and then he put it and hung it really high from the sign in our restaurant. And then the dancers would have to really go very high to get the money that was our donation to the Chinese hospital. And here's my mom, who worked with my dad 12 to 14 hours a day. And she was the one who held the family together. And they were amazing parents. The next slide, please. And this is my third drawing that I share of Oakland, Chinatown. And central to the drawing is the head of the lion that was made out of paper mache. And if it weren't COVID time, some of us would be going to San Francisco for the big celebration of the parade, and we'd see a lion like this. And if you look at the colors, red is always prevalent because it means good luck. And the yellow, because we are, that's the color that's given to us as Asian, the yellow people. And on the bottom of the drawing, there's my sister Leslie standing in the front of our rented Victorian. And if you move over to the right of Les, there is my brother-in-law's 1938 Plymouth parked in front of our house. And the little boy with the baseball cap is my brother, William Wong, who's a journalist. And he worked at the Oakland Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, and he was also a commentator on, let's see, one of the national programs, NewsHour with Jim Lara. And so in this drawing, if you look way at the top in the back, there's a faded image of a storefront on Franklin Street around the corner from us. Oakland, Chinatown main streets were Webster Street, 8th Street, and 9th Street. And it's different now in Oakland, Chinatown, although since COVID, the community has once again changed a lot. So on 9th Street and 9th and Franklin going to Broadway, it has become a Vietnamese part of the Oakland Chinatown. And Oakland Chinatown is no longer serving just exclusively the Chinese population. It's a mixed Asian population. But at that time that I was growing up, it was mainly families who came from the Pearl River Delta. And our parents came looking for gold on the streets, which is why we call America Gimsan. And my mother came and she said she didn't find any pieces of gold on the street. And she just said to me, oh yeah, you have food. If you come to America, you have to eat bitter. And there was bitter, but there was also sweet. And so what I want to do is to tell you what it was like to be a child of Chinatown. We were expected to go to American school. We were expected to go to Chinese school. In our family, because we had a restaurant, we were also expected to work at the restaurant. So my day went like this. I went to Lincoln Elementary School all day, and sometimes I came home at 12 noon and worked as a waitress. And then at 12:45, I would eat my lunch and run back to school. And then after school at 3 or 3:30, I would come back to the restaurant. And depending on when my Chinese school started, I would go to Chinese school about 5 or 5:30. And then I would come back at 7:30, sometimes eat my dinner and do my homework. And there was homework always from the American school and always from the Chinese school. And it happened to a lot of us because one of the reasons that Chinese families like to have a lot of children is because we could be a labor force. And so we became friends with all the other children in Chinatown. And we just love Chinese New Year because that's when the boys of Chinatown could sell firecrackers. And they would get the firecrackers and they would put them in their little bags and whatnot, and they would sell to passing cars. The drivers would stop and buy the firecrackers. And then when the police came, the people like Leonard Tom and Willard, a whole bunch of our friends, they would run to cars and hide the firecrackers on the tires of the car under the hood or something. And so it was a time of safety. It was a time of community. It was a time of celebration because Chinatown was a safe place for us to be. And unfortunately, I just read recently that a 91-year-old man was attacked during this time. And it just makes me really sad that that Chinatown has, during the COVID time, has just suffered so much as many other communities in Oakland. But Oakland Chinatown was very different from San Francisco Chinatown. We were more community-based in that we had families living actually in Chinatown, and we didn't have the tourist kind of attraction. And so for us to be a satellite of San Francisco Chinatown, it was exciting because in order to eat dim sum, or what we call changao in my dialect, we would have to drive over the bridge to eat the dim sum. And but now if you were prior to the COVID time in Chinatown, you could go and eat dim sum. And unfortunately, a victim of the COVID is the closing of the Peony restaurant that was like a dim sum palace in Hong Kong. And, you know, Chinatown has evolved, but the time that I lived there from 1943 to 1961 was a magical time for me because we all knew everyone. All the mothers took care of the children that ran into the stores if they were not in the families. We were the home of the Slin Nin Loy. The Slin Nin Loy were the men who came from China without any family, and they came to America to work, and they didn't go back to China. And so they were there in our community, and a lot of them worked for us at our restaurant. And one of my jobs was to go up into the apartment houses where they lived and knock on the door and tell them to come to work. And I can still remember those steep steps that I climbed. I can still remember knocking on the door, and they shared one bathtub and they shared one toilet. And I don't know how all those Slin Nin Loy did that, but they were so loyal to the families that hired them. And then in Chinatown, we also spoke English, but we also spoke Chinese. And because most of us were Hoisan people, we spoke the same dialect and we didn't have any problems. But during Chinese New Year, if I ran out into the street and called a man and said, and then they would give us a hongbao alisi. And so it was a community that really was intergenerational. And then by the time we graduated from high school and went to college, many of us started to move away. But in our hearts, we really still belong to Oakland Chinatown. So thank you very much for allowing me to share. Good night.
Thank you so much, Flo, for sharing your stories and experiences. Up next, dumplings, as promised. We have Christina Cho of the food blog Eat Show Food up next to share about dumplings.
Hi, thanks, Lynn. I'm Christina Cho. I'm a Bay Area-based food blogger, and I also teach dumpling making workshops. Just like Flo, I also come from a restaurant family. My grandpa had Chinese restaurants as I was growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, and so food and cooking together was always such a huge component of my life, and especially during Chinese New Year, which is probably the biggest food-centric holiday in the Asian community. It was always a really big deal, making a lot of different dishes, especially dumplings. I mean, the food during Chinese New Year is one incredibly delicious, but what I really love about it is that all the food on the table represents something. Every dish is symbolic to wish you a prosperous and just like amazing year ahead. You have noodles that represent long life, round foods that kind of mimic the shape of the moon or look like coins, and then of course dumplings. You can make dumplings all year round, but to eat dumplings during Chinese New Year, it's to kind of symbolize wealth, because the little bundles of dumplings look like kind of pouches of gold coins or bricks of gold. And making dumplings is one of my favorite things to do just in general. So in the next few minutes or so, I'm going to show a few different ways that I fold my dumplings. There's infinite ways to fold dumplings. So I'm going to tilt the camera down to what I call Dumpling Cam. And if anyone has questions, just let me know. So to start, I have dumpling wrappers, and I always use homemade dumpling wrappers. I think that is what sets apart an okay dumpling from an amazing dumpling. Homemade dumpling dough is pliable. It has so much more flavor. And once you get into the practice of making your own homemade dumpling wrappers, it's really hard to go back because they just taste so good. So I have about a tablespoon and a half of dumpling filling, and you can really make a dumpling filling out of anything. I'm going pretty classic with this one. I'm using ground pork, some Napa cabbage, green onions, and seasoned with soy sauce, salt and pepper, sambal, and a little bit of sesame oil. So to start, so you have it filled up so it's nice and neat in the center. And then in this first fold I'm going to do is the most classic dumpling fold. I just call it a classic pleated dumpling. And what we're going to do is fold it in half. And this is what I call in a lot of my classes the taco stage, because it looks like a little baby taco. And then these 2 points right here, the north and south points, we're going to just pinch them together. And because we have homemade dumpling dough, there's no need to wet the edges for the dough to stick. Okay, so once you have it set like that, your pinching is always going to be right here in the middle, and then all our pleats are going to happen right in the front. So you want to grab this left edge, just hold on to it and just bring it to the center. And by naturally doing that, you're creating just like a little bend in the wrapper, and that's your first pleat. Pinch, and then repeat. Grab another section of dough, bring it to the middle, and then one more time. Then once you're at the edge, just pinch it closed. Then you have a little wingtip, and then you're gonna flip to the other side, grab the other edge, bring it to the middle, pinch, 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 and pinch. And I have 4 on either side, so there's 8 pleats total, which is a pretty lucky number. And there you go. So that's the classic pleated dumpling. All your pleats are in the front, and then this back edge is smooth. So that's the kind of dumpling that you're going to see at most restaurants, or even at home. This is how my family pleats their dumplings. Okay. Then on to dumpling number 2. This is a little bit of a harder dumpling fold. I call it a zipper dumpling. It also looks like a leaf at the very end. And these names are not super standard. You can kind of call it whatever you think that the dumpling looks like. Okay, so again, we're gonna fold it in half. Got a baby taco. And then instead of pinching in the middle here, we're gonna pinch on this right end. You're gonna bring those 2 edges of the dough together and pinch it so they stick. One more time. Okay, and then you have this little tab of dough, and you're gonna hold on to it, move it up, over, and push down. And by pushing down, you have your tab of dough in the middle, and then these two kind of like butterfly wings. So you're gonna bring one wing to the center, pinch hard so it sticks. Bring the other wing to the center and pinch so it sticks. And then what you recreated is that same kind of tab of dough. And in the front, you're gonna see that these little pleats are starting to form. And so you're just gonna repeat that. Everything about making dumplings is about repetition. You're essentially just doing the same motion over and over again until your dumpling is fully sealed. And so some people might think that making dumplings at first feels a little stressful, especially if you're having a little difficulty doing it. But the more you practice, the better you get. And eventually, instead of being stressed, making dumplings will feel a little bit more meditative. Okay, so that is the zipper dumpling that looks a little bit like a leaf. And these ridges are really great for catching sauce like chili oil or dark soy. Okay, so those were two dumplings that are pretty pleat focused with a lot of intricate finger movements. This next one is a little bit easier to manage. It's especially great if you are making dumplings with kids and you want to put them to work so that they earn their Chinese New Year feast. It only requires a few simple bends really to make the dumpling. So you have it filled up, pinch in the middle, and then pinch all the way around. You're going to make kind of like a half moon. Okay, and we're not done yet, but you could always stop here if you wanted to. Like if you're really hungry or you're just tired of folding dumplings, like this will taste pretty good, but there's no folds in it. And so not having folds in it, you don't really have all those crevices to like catch sauce or to get like extra crispy. But from this point, you can do one more thing to make it, to have it have a little bit more dimension. So I'm holding my hands just like this. And these two ends of the dumpling wrapper, imagine they're like arms reaching for each other. So you're gonna kind of press down on the belly. You're gonna fold that end over, bring the other end over, and pinch so that they kind of stay interlocked. And then you make this really cute little teacup dumpling. It also looks like how you would make wontons. Wontons have a little bit of a different type of dumpling wrapper, but it's a very similar form and very easy to do. Then dumpling 4. Again, there's a lot of different ways to make dumplings. And dumpling number 4, I call it a braided dumpling. It also looks exactly like an empanada. So if you learn how to do this one, you can make dumplings and empanadas too. So just like that last one, we are going to pinch all the way around so that it's fully sealed, like that. And what we're going to do is kind of crimp this edge to make it look like it has a little bit of a braided effect. So we're going to start right here. And what we're going to do is fold that edge over. Pinch. So it stays, you have one segment. And then repeat. Just continue to fold that edge over and work your way around. And what's nice about this particular dumpling fold is that you have 2 flat edges that you can pan fry if you want to, so you can have extra crispy dumpling skin. Okay, there you go. And because we have some time, I'm also going to demonstrate how to roll out dumpling wrappers. So the dough, you want to kind of roll it out into a log, and then I'll portion it out into these smaller kind of little, I guess, little dough dumplings. And to roll it out into the wrapper, you want to transform this dough from kind of like a tiny little ball like this into a thin and wider circle. So to do that, all I do is kind of use my palm and I squish it. Just like that. And then I have a dumpling rolling pin, which you can find these like on the internet, or if you have a local, if you have a Chinatown near you, there are a ton of great home goods stores or kitchenware stores that will have these dowel dumpling rolling pins there. And this is the perfect size for making dumplings because dumplings are a small bite of food. It's only going to be like that big, and the wrapper's only this big. So you don't need a huge kind of French pastry style rolling pin. And to roll out dumpling wrappers, all you do, you position the rolling pin over the center of your dough, press down, roll out, rotate, and roll out. And so when you stop by a dumpling restaurant, you'll often find like aunties or uncles like in the kitchen making dumplings at lightning speed. And this is how they would do it. You just gradually work your way around. And with each turn, you're going to make your wrapper a little thinner and a little larger until you're happy with the size of it. Some people like really thick dumpling wrappers. Some like them really thin. So just make it the size you want it to be. And then eventually, with some practice, you're going to get a mostly round dumpling wrapper. And so as you practice, again, you're going to get even better at making dumplings. And in a normal situation, when we're not so reliant on a virtual format, we would all be, or our families would be making dumplings together. And so it's not quite as laborious as if you were making dumplings alone, because in a family setting, everyone has their stations. There's people who make the dough, roll out the dumpling wrappers, the pleaters, and then like someone that cooks all the dumplings. It's normally my mom in that scenario. And then of course there's the people that are there just to eat and enjoy the food. So you just find your station and enjoy the whole process. So are there any questions about dumplings or dumpling making in general?
We did just have a question about whether you teach classes.
I do, yes. I am teaching quite a bit right now for the Lunar New Year, but yes, on my website, eatshofood.com, I release different cooking classes. There's always a dumpling class involved, but I'll change it up per the season. And all those are on my website, and I have new classes coming out like every few months or so.
Awesome. And also, who taught you how to make these works of art? Somebody asks.
So that's kind of like a two-part answer. So I learned how to make dumplings like just watching my family. My dad is like the fastest dumpling maker. His like dumpling per minute is like ridiculously high. But at the same time, my family wasn't necessarily making like super crisp like dumplings all the time, you know, like they're more kind of like fast and rustic. They taste delicious, but they might not all be like the most consistent looking dumplings. So when I moved out to San Francisco on my own, I actually, before I became a food blogger, food person, I was a architect and designer. So I was always very like visual, and I just spent every Sunday, like I was missing my family, and I spent every Sunday actually making dumplings on my own and practicing. So I kind of taught myself the like the art of dumpling making.
And then what ingredients are in the dough?
So the dough is so easy. And I have the recipe on my website, but all it is, it's flour and hot water and a pinch of salt. If you want the exact ratios, it's like 10 ounces of all-purpose flour, 5 ounces of hot water, and a pinch of salt. You just knead it together until it's smooth-ish. You don't need to overwork it until it's like perfectly beautiful or anything like that.
So is your dad still way faster than you? Do you ever do like speed dumpling contests?
When I was the last time when I was home, I think we made dumplings, and we also made spring rolls, and again, he is still the fastest. I think maybe accuracy, well, he might have both of those, but I think maybe I'll have a little bit more accuracy than he does.
And then 2 more questions. What's your very favorite dumpling filling?
So I have, again, a two-part answer. I have a soft spot in my heart for like my family's, like the Cho family dumpling filling, which is like a 50-50 blend of pork and shrimp with cabbage. It just tastes like just like home. And then one of my favorite dumpling fillings that I make, and the recipe is also on my website, is a chicken and Thai basil dumpling. It's like like in the springtime or whenever you can get like really good like Thai or even like conventional Italian basil. And there's like fish sauce in it and raw red onion, and it just tastes, I don't know, like really flavorful, really fresh. And I think because it's chicken, it's also like it just tastes light, so you can eat more dumplings, which is a good thing.
Good,
Yeah.
good. That's always a good thing. Yeah. And then, have you ever made gluten-free dumplings?
So that's a very common question. And so there's different kinds of dumplings out there. Like the ones I just made today are wheat-based dumpling wrappers, of course, using just like all-purpose flour. And I am kind of experimenting with like a gluten-free flour blend and seeing how I can make it kind of replicate this texture and consistency. But there's also traditional Chinese dumplings that are gluten-free. So like hagao is a traditional one. It just might not be advertised as gluten-free because they might put soy sauce or something like that in the filling, but the wrapper is made with a blend of starches. And so those are called like crystal dumplings because when the starches all are mixed together and then steamed, they have a very like beautiful gem-like appearance. And I love making those. So those are kind of hard to make. I teach a class for those too, but they're like next level dumpling. Like once you feel comfortable making these, going to crystal dumplings is like the next natural step.
Okay, I saw one more comment, which I think will be a very good question to answer for many people. Dina says, my dumplings always fall apart when I put them in boiling water. How can I avoid this?
Okay, so my guess is that you might have some like holes or tears in your dumpling, or your dumpling skin is too thin. Because if you have any like tears in it, the hot water is gonna kind of get inside the dumpling and make it explode. Same thing with like pasta and stuff, you know? And to be honest, boiling dumplings is probably my least favorite of making dumplings. Like I might get some hate for that, but I prefer, if you're gonna cook dumplings, I prefer to either pan fry or steam them.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina, for showing us these beautiful dumplings. Can you say your website one more time for people who?
Yeah, my website is eat, E-A-T, cho, C-H-O, food, F-O-O-D.com.
And that's also in the YouTube description and the Facebook event description and our website. And also in the comments, we've dropped it a few times, so go check it out. Thank you so much. And yeah, I hope a lot of people try their hand at dumplings this weekend. All right, thanks. Gonna bring Lynn back on to wrap up the evening. Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Hello, Christina. I actually ate dumplings for dinner because I was prepping for night school. And I might do second dinner dumplings. But special thanks to Josh, Rebecca, Flo, and Christina. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope you all have a happy Lunar New Year tomorrow. And just a note to also please make sure to look out for each other and stay safe. Yeah. So next week, we're dedicating night school to sounds, from music to nature and even the universe. We'll talk about the history, concept, and technique of the theremin, which is the only instrument you play without touching. We'll also hear about how the songs of sparrows in the Bay Area have gotten sexier and sultrier amidst a quiet 2020 soundscape. And lastly, tune in to see how we can create music from the cosmos.
And then make sure, if you're watching on YouTube, to subscribe so you never miss a night school. We wouldn't want that. And also, the Academy, our doors are still closed, and we can't wait until we can tell you otherwise. But until then, the Academy and all the science we do and the animals we take care of are all really relying on your very generous support. And so we know it's a super hard time for everybody right now, but we'd very much appreciate any size donation. There's a link in the YouTube description where you can donate. But we mostly just really, really want to thank you for being here. And we love being here with you every Thursday night. So Lynn and I will see you next week. Good night, everyone.